Greetings everyone and welcome to part 2 in my DPS guide series. As promised today, we are going to take a look at some common build patterns, but before we can get into that, we're going to take a look at the damage formula and how our understanding of that can help us to choose our priorities and influence how they influence the build patterns that we're going to be taking a look at. Now, I'm a math person. I'm sure some of you guys out there are math people too, but you may not be, and I understand that. So before I start putting, equations on the screen and you go running for terror, just rest assured that I'm going to do my best to explain it, and I'm not going to assume that you have a sophisticated understanding of math. I'm going to try and make this as accessible as possible, and I'm also not going to go into every little tiny detail, and that's for two reasons. One, there's a couple of categories of things to talk about. One category is things that you either have no choice in the matter, such as, a Cat 1 boost that you get simply for being max level. People have figured out that as you level up, you get a Cat 1 bonus just associated with your character level. That's interesting. It's certainly a part of the gameplay mechanics. But it's not like you choose to do it, you can't turn it off or anything. There's no real decision making going on there, and the whole point of this series is to teach you the things you need to know to make informed decisions. So when it comes to things like that, I may mention it, but since it doesn't really suit our purposes, it's not really going to inform your choices, then it just becomes noise, and it becomes something we don't need to focus on. Other things that are kind of binary, there is a choice, but the only real choice is, do you do it or not? Like upgrading your weapons. I'm definitely going to tell you to upgrade your weapons, because as you upgrade the mark level of your weapons, they get a bonus. But there's no real choice in that. You either do it or you don't. So the choice is, yes, of course, do that. But there's nothing to really talk about other than just saying to do it. When it comes to the modifiers and upgrading the rarity on your weapons, on the other hand, that is a different story, because the higher the rarity of your weapons, the more modifiers they get. And since re-engineering is basically available on most items now, that means we do start having an informed choice to make, and we can take a look at those different modifiers and talk about which ones to choose and which not. So that's just an example of how some things to do with the game mechanics are going to be relevant for us, and some things are going to be less relevant. But now that we've gotten that out of the way, I also want to talk about where this information came from and give credit where it's due. I don't remember exactly when I started playing the game, maybe 6-7 years ago, something like that. For a long time, I was just piddling around in my cat bus with all turrets on it. By the time I actually started caring about any of this stuff, DPS, this stuff had already been figured out, and all these resources were available to me. They've been updated over time. But this is not my work, and I want to be very clear about that. I'm trying to explain it in the best way I can to make it useful to you, but I didn't come up with all this. Other people did. So you should definitely take a look at the Stow Build subreddit, because that's where I get most of this information from. And there's also a lot more details on there, so things that I leave out or I don't go into as much detail about, you can go there and take a look for yourself and find those details if that's something that you care about. Additionally, I want to give a shout out to all of the people who run the DPS channels, the people who made the parsers, the people who administrate the channels, who run the websites, who pay for the server hosting and all that. When it comes to any online game, really, I think it's only as good as its community, and we have a fantastic community of people who have given up their time and their money to provide us with all this stuff, all of these tools, all of these resources, all the guys over on Stow Builds who put in the hard work to figure out all of these formulas. And I have to say that we don't have access to the game code. I know the developers have stopped in there once or twice and corrected a thing or two or answered a question, but as far as what I'm going to show you in terms of the formulas, this is what the community has worked out on its own for the most part, so it may not be 100% accurate to what's actually going on in the game code, but as far as we know, this is as close as it gets, and it's pretty good approximation, if not right on the money. So I just wanted to be upfront about that and to make sure that all those people get the credit that they deserve. So now we're going to talk about the damage formula, at least in as much detail as makes sense for our purposes. I'm going to assume that you understand some basic arithmetic, you understand multiplication, and that's, really, if you can understand rational numbers or fractions, maybe you think of them as fractions, and multiplication, you should be able to get through this. If you know anything about compound interest, and as those words leave my lips, please try not to break your mouse heading for the subscribe button. But with compound interest, the way it works is it's a little bit more simplified version of what's going on here. You have a principal amount that you put in initially, and then every so often they pay you interest. After the first interest payment, that money goes into the account so that when you get the interest the next time, you're getting interest on the interest you earned the first time. And then it just continues to build. And I'm going to put a graph up here of what the compound interest looks like, and you can see that it's exponential. So that as time goes on, you keep double dipping, triple dipping, quadruple dipping, you're earning interest on the interest you earned from the interest you earned, etc., etc. And that's the same principle that's going on here. I'm going to go ahead and put the formula up, or at least a version of it up, the damage formula that is. And it's a similar idea, but with the compound interest, the interest is the same every time usually. And so there's a way to simplify the formula if you look that up online. But here, each time it's a little different. So instead of having the same interest percentage every time, they're all different. And so we have to have we can't simplify it down to some nice thing with an exponent. We actually have to have each term done individually. Each term has to have its own little formula to go with it. So what are the ones that are sort of common to everything? Well, you've got Cat 1 and Cat 2, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about. If we're following the compound interest example, the principal, the amount that you initially put in, is what we call base damage. And weapons and abilities all have a base damage that they do. You can think of that as your initial deposit. That's what we're putting in there. And then because multiplication is commutative and associative, we can shuffle these terms around any way you want. I've shuffled these around a little bit differently than you'll see on the Stow Builds Reddit, because I wanted to put some of the optional stuff at the end, depending on what kind of weapons and abilities you're using. The end result is always the same. But we talk about Cat 1 and Cat 2. If you saw my Legendary Connie video, I had a little mini TED Talk in there where I went over that. You could go find that and watch that if you want. But basically, the takeaway is that they are mathematically the same. They work the same. And how they work is that you take, like a list. You have a list of all of the things in your build that give you a Cat 1 damage boost, and you add all those up. So let's say you had 3 items. In reality, you're going to have way more than that. But just for example, let's say you had 3 items that gave you a Cat 1 boost. One's 50%, one's 20%, one's 30%. So you add all those up and you get 100%. And then that becomes your Cat 1 boost, 100%. For Cat 2, it's the same way. Let's say you had 2 items. One gave you 5% Cat 2 and one gave you 10% Cat 2. You add those together and that's your Cat 2 bonus. It's going to be 15%. So that's how that works. You add them up first. If you see that symbol there, that's the summation symbol. I'm going to highlight it there. And that's really all that it means. It just means you take all the different sources and you add them together, and then that's your percentage for that month, if you're thinking in terms of compound interest. So for that application, you add them all up, and then that's the one that you go with. For all the others, they're all independent. This is the Cat 1 and Cat 2 are special that way. It's the only one where they get added together first. All the other ones stand on their own. So that's how Cat 1 and Cat 2 works. And as far as how to prioritize them, you've probably heard that Cat 2 is better than Cat 1. And the reason for that is nothing to do mathematically in terms of the formula. It has to do with the fact that Cat 1 bonuses are very prevalent, they're very easy to get, and they tend to be in very large amounts. Whereas Cat 2 bonuses tend to be much smaller, there aren't as many of them, they're harder to get, oftentimes they're temporary instead of being active all the time. So when you look at a graph of Cat 1 versus Cat 2, the optimal distribution is to have an equal amount of both. In practice, that's not possible. So you're going to favor Cat 2 over Cat 1, not because there's anything special about Cat 2 boosts. It's just that you're going to have a lot less of them. It's not as saturated. So you're going to get a larger relative benefit if you take more Cat 2 boosts than Cat 1 boosts. I hope that makes sense. So you take your base damage, you multiply it by the total of your Cat 1 damage boosts, gets multiplied by the total of your Cat 2 damage boosts. What's next in the formula? Now we have a new one. It's for the product. It's for multiplying them all together. That's just because to simplify the formula a little bit. Who knows how many final damage multipliers you're actually going to have at any one time, but they're pretty rare, and I'm going to link in the description the Stowe Builds Reddit page where it goes over the damage categories, and it has a pretty exhaustive list of all the different boosts in the game, and it tells you what category they belong to. The list for final damage multipliers is pretty short, so you're not going to have that many to choose from. It's unlikely you're going to have more than one going at a time, but in case you did, those would each get multiplied separately. Then you have the range drop off. So you have basically you're penalized for using energy weapons if you're too far away from the target. So you can start targeting enemies at 10 kilometers, but you're going to get punished for that. So there is a way to make up for that in the skill tree. We're going to go over that later when we actually go over some builds in later videos. So if you're too far away, that multiplier is going to be less than 1. It's going to reduce your damage. So it's a negative final damage multiplier. I've had people in the comments always say, you look like an idiot. Don't you know how to do anything but get right up next to the enemies and just sit there and shoot them? And there's a reason for that. There's multiple reasons for that, but one of them is this. You want to get close to your enemies, especially if you're using energy weapons, because you are being penalized if you're too far away from them. The next thing in here, optional, in the sense that it only applies to energy weapons and exotic damage abilities, and that has to do with your subsystem power. If you're using energy weapons, it's going to be take your energy weapon power, and the formula is your energy weapon power plus 100 divided by 200. If you're talking about exotic damage abilities, it's going to take your auxiliary power plus 100 divided by 200. And what that means is that at 0 power, you're going to get 50%. You're only going to be doing half your damage. At 100 power, you're going to be doing 100%, not 100% extra. You're just not going to be penalized. And then above 100% power, you're going to get a bonus, and that's going to be a final damage multiplier. And what this means is that at 125 power, which is the most you can normally get, you're going to get a 12.5% final damage multiplier. At 150 power, you're going to get a 25% final damage multiplier for those abilities, either energy weapons or exotic, respectively. Projectiles, torpedoes, mine launchers, that kind of thing, they're not affected by any subsystem power, so you don't have to worry about that term at all. That's why I put range fall-off multiplier and the auxiliary and weapon ones at the end, because they don't always apply to everything. They don't apply to torpedoes, for example. So that is the formula that says how much damage are your abilities actually putting out there. You take the base damage of that weapon or ability, multiply it by the sum of your Cat 1 boosts, multiply that by the sum of your Cat 2 boosts, multiply that by each individual final damage multiplier from an ability or a clicky or whatever, then multiply that times your ranged penalty if you're using energy weapons, and then multiply that by the bonus you get for your subsystem power for energy weapons based on weapon power or auxiliary abilities using auxiliary power. But that's not the end of the story. That's how much damage is actually leaving your ship and going to the enemy. After that, it gets divided because ships have hull and they have shields. So some portion of that damage is going to go to shields, some portion is going to go to hull. There is shield bleed through. That is, you're always going to have a little bit of that damage is going to get through the shields. How much depends on how much shield pin you have, how much bleed the shields have, and things like that. This gets a lot more complicated when it comes to PvP. It's less complicated when it comes to PvE, which is all we really care about. And then once it's decided how much damage goes to shields, how much goes to the hull, each one, the hull and the shields, have or can have different resistances. So you could have a really high hull resistance and a really low shield resistance. And again, that's a lot more complicated for the PvP side of things because the mechanics are more complicated for player characters than they seem to be, as far as we know, for PvE enemies. So what that means is they have some level of resistance, possibly zero, but they may have some resistance. And if we lower that, we can not only lower it to zero if they have resistance, but it can actually be lowered below zero. And if you can get the enemy's resistance into the negative, it will actually cause them to take more damage, and it will act as a damage multiplier. So that's why damage resistance reduction, or DRR for short, is important, because it allows us to have another way of getting a final damage multiplier. Okay, what else can we glean from this? Well, one thing that's not in the formula is that this is the formula for each attack, each weapon attack, each ability. If we can do more abilities, then we'll do more damage. So haste and similar things to haste are going to be important for each build type. Okay, let's talk about the different build patterns. If you watched the first video, you saw that I had 3 of them: directed energy weapons, or DO, Psi for science, and TORP for torpedo and kinetic builds. For energy weapon builds, you want to look for haste. You want to look for Cat 1 and Cat 2 boosts. That includes crit chance and crit severity. You want to look out for final damage multipliers. That can include things that increase your weapon power, like override subsystem safeties. You want damage resistance reduction from things like attack pattern beta. You want uptime on your firing abilities, and that means that you're going to need an extender. And that's going to depend on the affordability on which one you're using. You've got cannons, and you've got beams, you've got single target, and you've got AoE. The 2 AoE traits come from C-Store ships, whereas the single target ones come from a Lobby ship and a promo ship. So if affordability is your issue, and we're going to get into builds in later videos, AoE is definitely the way to go. So when you're looking at the traits for an energy weapon build, you're going to start with emergency weapon cycle if you have it, and an extender for your firing mode. You're going to want to have attack pattern beta. You're going to want to have energy amplifier batteries for the Cat 2 damage. And you're going to want to have crit chance, crit severity, all that kind of stuff. You often see locators and exploiters from the Fleet Spire. Why are they on every build? That's because they give Cat 1 boosts plus crit chance or severity, depending on which one you're using. And keep in mind, in later videos, we are going to go over specific builds. So I'm not trying to give you a comprehensive list of things to use yet. I'm just trying to tell you what the general template for these things are. For torpedoes, you don't have anything like haste, but what you do have is a shared cooldown on the torpedoes. So you can only fire a torpedo every so often. There is a cooldown between each torpedo. You want to reduce that. You reduce it with things like the ferrofluid console from the Terran rep, or ceaseless momentum, which is a starship trait if you can get it. Then you want to cheat out extra firing modes from things like entwined tactical matrices and concentrate firepower, which will give torp spread and torp high yield respectively. And again, those firing modes are final damage multipliers. And then you want to stack Cat 1 and Cat 2. That includes crit chance and severity. And you want the damage resistance reduction, just like for the energy weapons. For science, there is nothing like haste. you can only reduce the cooldown of abilities so far, so the way that you get around that is to just stack as many as you can. Fill up all of those bridge officer seats with exotic damage dealing abilities. Also, certain torpedoes can create hazards and anomalies that will do exotic damage, as well as clickies from consoles, set bonuses, etc. Just get as many as you can so that you can spam them that way. And then the usual stuff: damage resistance reduction, Cat 1 and Cat 2, crit chance and severity, and then of course there are batteries. There are kinetic amplifier batteries for the torpedoes, and there is exotic damage batteries as well that can give you Cat 2 boosts for that. And there's a few special ones you want to look out for exotic damage because they tend to be very high and they only apply to exotic damage. Things like the particle manipulator trait from the R&D school, and also the new revolutionary two-piece gives a lot of exotic damage crit severity. So that's something to look out for, as well as increasing your max aux power. So I hope that I've given you a few useful tidbits in this video, unlike the last one. I know it was a lot to go over the damage formula, and I encourage you, if you want more details, you can either ask questions or follow the links in the description to the Stow Builds Reddit and look at the pages they have there because they go into more detail. And we are going to have build videos in the future near the end of this series where I actually go over entire builds at different budget levels, free to play, buy some stuff from the C-store, and then, all out, everything's on the table. So, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you in the next one. Take care. Bye.